Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the Jerusalem-based Israel Democracy Institute, a non-partisan center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the functioning of Israeli democracy. This event is also co-sponsored by UCLA's Department of Political Science. I'm Dov Wackman. I'm the director of the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, professor of political science, and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. I'll be serving as the moderator for today's event, and I'm very happy to be participating in this with our two very distinguished speakers. Before I introduce them, I just want to explain how the next hour and a quarter will go. I'm going to structure this conversation into three parts. First, we're going to talk about the current political crisis in Israel over the Supreme Court, which I'm sure is on everybody's minds right now. Then we're going to look at the Israel Democracy Index, the Israeli Democracy Index, which is the flagship publication of the Israel Democracy Institute. Now it's out, just came out last year, it's celebrating its 20th anniversary. And then finally, I will pose questions to the speakers from you, the audience. So I want to encourage you to send us your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. And now, without further ado, I want to welcome our two speakers, Yohanan Plesner, the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, and Professor Tamar Herman, the director of the Israel Democracy Institute's Viterbi Family Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research, and also a professor of political science at the Open University. Now, I won't read their full bios, which are extensive. Instead, you can read those on the chat box. So welcome, Yohanan and Tamar.
Hi, Dov. Hi, Yohanan.
Hi. So I want to start with you, Yohanan. You have been involved in Israeli politics yourself. You've personally worked in the past with Prime Minister Netanyahu. You know as well as anyone that, this issue of judicial quote unquote reform or the overhaul of the judiciary has been something that's long been, proposed on the right for many, many years, but until now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has never backed those proposals. So what's changed? Why is this happening now, do you think?
Again, thanks for having me, and good evening from Israel. Well, those are not regular times or regular days in Israel. You mentioned the sort of long aspiration of some to make changes, instigate changes in Israel's judiciary and constitutional balance. But this is not what's at stake right now. Right now, we're experiencing something entirely different, an entire overhaul of the constitutional balance that was created and established in Israel since the foundation of the state. It's not long overdue reform that now a newly elected and legitimate government has decided to promote. We had many such issues, and educational reform and reform in many economic areas. It's something of an entirely different order of magnitude. It's a cluster of initiatives that is promoted with one goal in mind: to concentrate all governing power in the hands of the political majority. All governing power, basically making sure that the executive branch, that essentially and de facto already controls the legislative branch in Israel, will also de facto control the judiciary. It will appoint the judges. It will sap their authority for conducting judicial review, both over the Knesset and over administrative decisions of the government. It will basically leave us as a democracy that flourished, and we developed a successful economy and a vibrant democracy without a constitution, without a system of checks and balances that characterizes most democracies, without a Bill of Rights. We nevertheless, because we had a strong independent judiciary and some traditions that evolved over 7.5 decades, we nevertheless had a vibrant democracy that we're proud of. But it's a fragile democracy. We are a divided society with an existential threat, and it's and in today's era of social networks and so on, we are especially vulnerable to the rise of populism, as we're seeing in other parts of the world. But when populism lifts its head in a country without constitutional and institutional safeguards, like in Israel, it creates a threat that can produce a very, very negative, harsh, and grim outcome. And this is perhaps why you're seeing so many Israelis from all walks of life fighting for the basic fundamental freedoms and checks and balances and constitutional features of their country. And I must say, this moment of democratic awakening is inspiring, heartwarming, and provides much room for optimism.
Well, I want to hear some of that optimism in a minute and talk about the protest, but I just going back to this, you know, I think I agree with you. We shouldn't think of this just as a kind of judicial reform. It's much broader, much more radical than that. And it really does, as you said, seek to change, you know, to impose complete executive power, essentially. But so if this is a power grab, essentially, by the executive, by the government, it still begs the question of why now? I mean, and you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been Prime Minister for a long time, with this short exception of the Bennett-Lapid government, why make this power grab now? I mean, you know, or maybe to put it differently, what do they hope to do with this power?
Well, it's a great question. Why now? Because Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you mentioned, has been at the helm of Israeli politics for a generation. He very skillfully, with great talent, communicated the merits of Israel's democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. He was probably the best model of our democracy throughout, you know, the 80s, and his role as ambassador, speaking about the importance of an independent and professional and strong judiciary, and that this is why also so many Israelis, when they voted for Mr. Netanyahu just recently in the election, don't have a sense of fear that he will redirect the system in an anti-democratic manner, because he's been around. It's not someone new who sort of ran a populist campaign and overtook the system. It's the known... He
previously opposed some of these judicial...
Exactly. It's the known Mr. Netanyahu. So what happened? There's three factors. Number one, the ultra-Orthodox parties. Ultra-Orthodox parties, their vision for the Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is a different vision. Their vision is on a Jewish state run based on the halakha, on Jewish, religious Jewish law, and no perception of democracy as we know it, of rule of law and human rights and separation of powers and independent judiciary. They have a different perception, but they were a small minority, and therefore their vision was only something that you could sort of write in books or talk about in seminars, but it had no political influence. They are demographically stronger, and in Mr. Netanyahu's current coalition, they're all powerful because they 18 seats out of 120, 18 out of 64 of Netanyahu's coalition, but he has no options. He needs them, and they have this vision. The far right party that represents the extreme elements of the radical right and extreme elements within the settler movement, led by the finance minister Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, this party has a sort of long, or this part of Israeli political life has a long, I would say, account with the independent court, because in their eyes it prevented them from fulfilling their aspirations vis-a-vis West Bank settlements on private Palestinian land and so on. So those are two factors that existed in Israeli public life, but were in a minority and therefore irrelevant. the big changes, the change that occurred with the Likud led by Mr. Netanyahu. Netanyahu, who traditionally was led the Likud, the National Liberal Likud Party, that was the defender of the independent judiciary, the defender and promoter of liberal values. This was the role that Likud played in public life. And now Likud under Netanyahu over the past few years has transformed into a populist leadership, anti-establishment, anti-institutions. Obviously, it's connected to Mr. Netanyahu's personal situation. He's confronting the legal system. He was indicted for severe, with a suspicion of severe corruption charges, and he basically transformed his attitude towards the court system and joined the other, I would say, anti-constitutional forces. This, by the way, Dov, does not represent the view of a majority of Israeli people. I would imagine that Tamar will talk about.
That's what I was just about to ask Tamar about.
While Israelis support Mr. Netanyahu's leadership, they trust him on the economy and on security, they didn't choose this.
So Tamar, if you can tell us a little bit about the Israeli public opinion, specifically, first of all, on the Levin plan, on the judicial overhaul that's being proposed. Yohanan mentioned that it doesn't have public support. How does the Israeli public view it? And what kinds of divisions or differences of opinion exist within the Israeli public over this plan?
Okay, thank you, Dov. Thank you, Yohanan. Of course, I agree with the picture that Yohanan just talked about, but my argument will be that the crisis started well before the last 2 or 3 months, and I'll show you some data that we collected for the index of 2022, but also very recently, and you'll see that this is a continuation of something that was there. Maybe it was more in the air than now it's more on the ground, but basically it is not a new phenomena. And we'll start, hopefully. Okay. What you see here is that only a minority of the Israeli public, this is January 23rd, only a bit more than 1/3 actually are optimistic about the state of democratic governance in Israel. But if you look back, actually we started measuring it in 2019, and still it was almost always below 1/2. So it means that there is some sense of danger existing in the psyche of the Israeli public, at least for 3 years now. We could show you data even before that, but still, you can see that it goes back well before the last elections. There is a sense of pessimism, of depression regarding the democratic governance in Israel. And it's interesting because on all levels of life in Israel, actually life is pretty good for most Israelis, economically speaking, and also security-wise. Until very recently, things seem to be very, very stable. And now you asked me about how things are split within Israeli public. What you see here is 2 columns, one representing the voters of the parties of the coalition, and the other one represents the views of the voters of the public, of the parties in the opposition. As then you can see, while the majority of the coalition voters are optimistic about the future of the Israeli democracy, a larger majority amongst the voters of the opposition see it totally differently. I would say they see it in a totally opposite way compared to the coalition voters, which means that we have actually not one Israeli public, but at least 2 Israeli publics, and we will see that we have more than 2. But the division runs here. And very interestingly, we always ask our respondents in the democracy index surveys, what's the strongest tension in Israeli society? And indeed, the tension between left and right, which in the last 2 years was considered as lesser than the tension between Jews and Arabs, is now again at the top of the perceived tensions in Israeli society. And now we asked them several times, is Israeli democracy in grave danger? And as you can see, the difference between, or the differences between the three main political blocs is amazing, because on the left, you can see that 80%, this is almost a consensus, say, yes, they agree that Israel is in a grave situation as far as the threat to its democracy exists. The center actually jumped and is now very, very close to the left. However, since June 2022, we see a decline in the number of those thinking this way amongst those who define themselves as the right. So again, what I show you here is that we cannot talk about one public opinion. And the question is how these so different political groupings can live together and find some joint vision for the future. We also asked our respondents if they are worried that they will not be able to maintain their lifestyle because of the increased influence of other groups. And as you can see, amongst the ultra-Orthodox, the national religious, the traditional religious, and the traditional non-religious, we do see an increase when we go from the very Orthodox to the less ones. But amongst the secular, that are 43% of the Israeli Jewish population, we see a significant majority, 60%, who are quite worried or very worried that they will not be able to maintain their lifestyle, which means that they feel that in a way the state is changing its face in a way that will make their life quite uncomfortable, to say at the least, maybe even unbearable. And the fact that it goes like that, almost in a linear way, is very untypical to political sciences, because normally we will not see such a straight line. It tells you that the variable of religiosity plays a very, very significant role in Israeli politics, particularly as in all these four groups, the majority up to the 100% amongst the ultra-Orthodox, they put themselves on the right side of the political continuum, whereas the secular are divided almost equally between the left, center, and right. So basically what we see is that the right and the Orthodox right has a very strong foothold in Israeli society, and therefore those aspiring that in the next elections things will change dramatically, I think that something very mega should happen in order for this to happen in the future, because we know that people, and also young people in Israel, tend to stay where they came from and not change the political views so dramatically, although we don't know what will happen following this wave of protests that we are seeing. And the last issue that I want to mention here is the decline, actually, since 2015 in the average trust of the Israelis in all the institutions. And as you can see, the mean is 47, less than half. But actually, since 2015, we see a constant decline, which brings us by the end of 2023 to only 1/3 who are trustful of the state institutions. So, in other words, we are in a very, I would say, worrying situation for quite a long time now, and this is just what we see here is in a way the cherry on top of this very problematic situation.
I want to come back to what's driving some of those trends in public opinion that you've described. And it was striking that data from January 20. This was before really the government had introduced its plan, right? Before the scale of the proposals was clear, and before the protests really had gotten started. So I want to ask, going back to Yohanan now, about these protests. Have you been surprised by the scale? I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, something like 3% of all Israelis have come out in these demonstrations, and not just once, but repeatedly, week after week, in huge numbers. The events of yesterday indicate that things are escalating on the streets in Israel. Can you just talk a little bit about what you see happening, the dynamic on the streets, both in terms of the protests, what's driving them, what makes up these protesters, and maybe something about how you see their chances for success in terms of stopping this judicial overhaul?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised at the fact that there's opposition to such an aggressive plan, both in terms of its content and in terms of the process. But I must say, surprised at the way that so many Israelis, you mentioned the number, it's not just every week, it's during the week. It's about 200,000 who left their jobs on a Monday and went up to Jerusalem on hundreds of buses and on the train, and then another Monday, and then yesterday's protests throughout the country and blocking roads, and I mean, it's something. 7,000 in Kfar Saba, 100,000 in Tel Aviv, 35,000 in Haifa at the same. So it's something that we've never experienced. So I would not be I would not say that I would have predicted it. I don't know. I don't think that anyone predicted it. It's I think to connect it to what Tamar to the figures that Tamar shared with us just now. One figure that illustrates it, it's the 70% of secular Israelis who feel that there's an actual risk to their way of life, and that they won't be able to practice their way of life the way they believe it, and a sense that this institutional overhaul, it does not come as a benign theoretical constitutional, it's not a sort of abstract drill in constitutional law in university. There's a coalition agreement that has a playbook that has to be implemented later on. It has elements of segregation between men and women in the public sphere, and discrimination in the provision of goods. It has elements of religion and state, or wanting to allocate state grants and subsidies in an unequal manner, mainly to the ultra-Orthodox population. It can pave the way to corruption and decline of public sector and public goods. It can open up and pave the way for flooding the public sector with political appointments with no judicial review, neither on the appointments nor on the outcome and benevolence of the decisions. So I mean, perhaps the one mistake that those who initiated this cluster of initiatives made was the arrogance and the fact that they brought it all at once in one package, and that I think brought so many ghosts out in terms of every Israeli, and that's I'll end with that, perhaps a psychological explanation. Every Israeli, if you scrape the surface of their skin, deep enough, there's a trauma of persecution, of escape from whether it's Europe or the Arab states, of the attacks on our state. So there's something, in us as Jews living in a country with an existential threat that, it's always looming. And it's all of a sudden like this, the threat has shown its face. And many compared this moment to the Yom Kippur 73 war in terms of the extent of the threat, but this time it's a threat from within, but it causes Israelis to step up just as they did then.
So I think it's a very important point that you're making, because I think from overseas it can, it can seem that this is about the Supreme Court, right? This is about the power and independence of the Supreme Court. But actually what's driving these protests is a much bigger set of concerns, underlined by Tamar's, by the survey data, which shows the fears of a significant, like at least, one part of the Israeli public about the future of Israeli democracy and about their very way of life. In many ways, as you say, this is they perceive this now as an existential issue. The existential threat is no longer external or less external, and is now this internal. Given that, and given the high stakes that are perceived by the protesters, where do you see this dynamic going? I mean, there are dire predictions that we're hearing, mass refusal to serve in reserve units, crippling labor strikes, even the possibility of political violence. If this is now seen as a kind of life or death issue for at least, a large segment of the Israeli public, do you see any way of de-escalating this situation? Are you hopeful that a compromise?
Well, it can end in a moment. One person, his name starts with the letter B, Benjamin Netanyahu, can decide to halt this legislation, and the whole event will, the entire temperature will reduce. But so far it seems that they're just stepping on the gas pedal and moving up with this entire cluster of initiatives across the board in a very vulgar and aggressive manner. So of course it can end. Now, Israel's story is in many ways is a miracle. It's a miracle of Israelis that built up an extremely successful society and economy out of nothing, except for human capital, entrepreneurship, initiative, commitment, and all of those depend on a free spirit, on independent functioning institutions, not only on independent court. The independent court system is the foundation, but then we need independent institutions like an independent higher education system. This cannot exist in a country where all power is controlled in the executive branch. Art system, so the entire economic life, and of course the high-tech sector, that depends on entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurs and the human capital that makes it up, and the foreign investors that need protection for their investments. They're like another minority. They're a minority that's shipped their money. 90% of Israel's high-tech miracle depends on foreign capital, and about half of our high-tech employees are employed by multinationals in an era where we're expecting decline and depression, and this money can go anywhere. So literally the components that enabled this balance, that made the economic miracle that worked so well for us during COVID. So many countries went into recession. We pretty much paid back within a year the entire increase in debt to GDP ratio. We went up from about 60 to 73, and we're back to 60. High tech is more than half of our exports, and the leaders of the protests are the leaders of the high tech industry and the employees who understand exactly where things are heading, and they're fighting for the country that they love. You mentioned, and perhaps we can end with that, the protest of IDF reservists. This is something that we've never seen. I can share with you perhaps from a personal standpoint. I'm a reservist also, and I'm a major in reserves in Sayeret Matkal, the Special Forces Unit. We have the different WhatsApp groups that serve us as reservists to coordinate our reserve service. Never in decades of service did our reservists come around any I would say politically or publicly controversial issue. Now it's entirely different. We have a group of more than 1,000 Sayeret Matkal graduates. I think it's pretty much all graduates in the units, or next to 80 or 90% of the units, the graduates are getting together, organizing protests, roadblocks, and the same is with all with fighter pilots and all the other units, because they understand that they're in their eyes fighting for the future of their country. And I think if you want to compare between, say, Israel and Hungary or Poland, where their democracies have been demolished within a relatively short period, Israel has those networks of Israelis that are connected, members of reservists and other social networks that are surprisingly rigid and strong, and in many ways are the ones that are leading now the protest against this onslaught.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I know that Robert Putnam, the political scientist at Harvard, famously talked about the erosion of social ties and networks in the United States, and that the weakening of American civil society. So in some respects, we can see these protests and the mobilization as an indication of the strength of Israeli civil society and the strength of those social networks and social ties. The survey data that Tamar knows very well paints an alarming picture. I think the 2022 Democracy Index, particularly in showing these trends over time, as Tamar started presenting us with, shows this kind of erosion in the trust in state institutions and in support for democratic principles. Tamar, as you see that data, do you see this crisis as even if this immediate crisis is resolved, is there a broader underlying crisis or chronic decline in the quality of Israeli democracy as evidenced by those public attitudes?
Yeah, actually, what we heard right now is actually focusing on a specific group in Israeli society. Let's see those who participated in the protest. This is last month, 15%. We measured it last week, and 20% said that they participated in at least one act of protest amongst the Jews. However, amongst the Arabs, the situation is not that wonderful. And in fact, they are not taking a significant part in the protest. And what's more interesting is that they don't take part in the process, although 82% of them said in February 23 that they are afraid that something very bad will happen to their rights if this process will continue. So in a way, they see a danger coming, but they don't see themselves as part of the Israeli public protesting against what is happening on the political level. And in a way, it is understandable if we see the increase in the number of those defining themselves as being on the right, that Israeli Jews should have more rights than non-Jewish citizens, okay? When you have 2/3 saying, yes, Jews should have more rights, this explains why Arabs feel alienated from, I would say, almost every part of Israeli politics. Indeed, the left is not of that opinion, but the left is only 12% of the Israeli Jewish population, and the center is about 30%. So altogether, what we see is that the right is much, much stronger, and they also play a role in what is happening as of today regarding the protests. So we should keep in mind that there are many Israelis who do not share these views, and they actually, I'll show you in a minute, they think that Netanyahu and his governments are a good thing. Maybe they don't like every item on the agenda of the Levin blueprint, but they do feel that it's the right thing to have a right-wing religious ultra-Orthodox government. So we can be mistaken by the media clips and what we read in the media, in the printed media, for example, which is strongly pro-protest by and large, of course. But we should keep in mind that even if we have 20% like our latest finding, is 20% only, 80% did not take part in that. It's not a revolution from below against what's happening. But Yochanan is right, these are the strongest groups in Israeli society. They are the more educated, the more well-to-do economically. They sit in very central roles in the academia, in the economy, in the high-tech industry, and so on and so forth. So there is also a class issue here that wasn't mentioned before. There is a class issue, there is ethnic origin issue, because the participants, when we asked them about the ethnic background, the majority were Ashkenazi. They were all mixed origin. They were not Sephardi or Mizrahi. So what we see here are actually overlapping cleavages rather than cross-cutting cleavages. And we know how dangerous is to a democracy if all cleavages are actually overlapping, because then you have very separate groups or tribes, as the former president of Israel, Rivlin, said, tribes even, that do not have much of a common language with them. And now the question is, how do we come out, assuming that Netanyahu will not step down tomorrow morning, and we will have to get to some understanding. How do we do that with people of such different sentiments, attitudes, and even language?
Absolutely. So I mean, I think you make a very important point that, although the numbers of Israelis protesting are unprecedented, it does still represent a small slice of the Israeli public.
I would say, Tamar, respectfully, the 20% of the Jewish population coming out to protest is quite a dramatic figure.
It is. But they are made of one piece of cloth.
The population would mean 70 million Americans coming out. I wouldn't treat it as a regular event.
I think that it's a dramatic event, but what I'm saying is that they are like peas in a people. They are very similar to each other. We find very few Orthodox, certainly not ultra-Orthodox, very few Arabs, very few newcomers from the former Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So was it, composed of people of all walks of life? I would have been more optimistic about the possibility of this protest to really make a change, because you'll have agents in each public sector. And what I'm saying is that we are talking amongst ourselves to a large degree and with the same language.
Do we know anything? I mean, Tamar, you look at the monthly, you do the monthly index as well. So is there any data on, I think Yohanan described very well the opponents and why, many secular, more affluent, and more highly educated Israelis are opposing or out on the streets. But what do we know about the people who voted for the coalition? What do we know about, say, particularly Likud voters? I mean, I heard, there was reports in the media of even some settlers protesting, joining these protests. So do we have any data on how people, on the attitudes toward the Levin plan, and maybe more broadly, of those who voted for the coalition, and particularly Likud voters? Is it, related to that, is this really the difference in attitudes driven primarily by religiosity, as with so many other things? I mean, are we really talking about that being the major determinant? So if you can break down a bit the views of those on the right and the coalition voters.
Yeah, religiosity is indeed a very significant factor in shaping people's views. But I want to show you something that we talk about a lot in the IDI, that even amongst the Likud voters, they are not so keen about the various parts of this program. They might be in support for the overall need to change, but if you look at this slide, you can see that only 45, these are Likud voters. So 75% are support the proposal that when the Supreme Court strikes down a law on the grounds of that it contravenes basic laws, the Knesset will be empowered to override it. Okay, this is the basic thing. But about other components, we see that they are not so supportive. In other words, they might be in general for the direction, but this is not what they expected to happen in details. And this is why it might be possible to address them and explain what are the dangers that are invested in this proposal, even for them as individual citizens. And this is the way that one might, in a way, put some wall between the basic support for a right-wing government and even personal support for Netanyahu, but to explain why this is very dangerous for everyone, including themselves. And we do see an increase in the number of those who define themselves as Likud voters who disagree with the direction that the entire legislation process is taking, particularly on the basis that it is not done in dialogue with the other side of the political map. Because when we ask people, what is your main concern? These days, they will tell you that these are the gaps in the Israeli, mainly Jewish public. So they are concerned because of what they see is being understood by these moves by parts of the Jewish public, which they see as part of the nation. Okay, so they are also worried, even if they are not so worried about every item of the Levin's agenda, they are worried about the very splits that they are now rising to the surface.
So they're worried about polarization, and I think rightly so, given the dynamic that's happening in Israel at the moment. But I want to dig a little bit more into the attitude toward democracy itself, because I think the data that in the democracy index shows that among Israelis on the right, they prefer the Jewish element of Israel's identity,
absolutely,
democratic element, and their belief is that Jews should have greater rights in Israel. than Arab citizens, that important decisions should only be made by a Jewish majority, and that really the balance between Israel's democratic and Jewish identity should be shifted more strongly in terms of Israel's Jewish identity. So in many ways, is the fact that they're not participating in these demonstrations because in many ways they don't have those concerns about Israeli democracy. If anything, you have one part of the public that's committed to the democratic aspect of Israel's identity, and the other half of the Israeli public that's more committed to the Jewish aspect of Israel's identity. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely, but I also want to emphasize that we don't see a counter movement to the anti-legislation movement, because by the theoretical literature, once you have such a strong anti-government movement, you'll find a pro-government movement, and we don't see such a pro-government movement, which means that even if they dislike some of the democratic aspects, and indeed we saw some very severe erosion. For example, we see now a big majority saying that Arabs should not be allowed to buy lands in Israel. We see more and more Jews saying that they don't want to live together in the same building or in the same neighborhood with Arabs. This is under the influence of the May 21 events. And still, they don't go in the streets in order to clash with the anti-government movement, which means that they have some hesitations here, that what is seen now exceeds even their, I would say, most desired aspirations for the Jewish side of the state of Israel.
Dov, with your permission, I'd like to sort of build on that.
Please.
It's true that the more you move to those who identify themselves as right wing or more religious, the Jewish component of the Jewish and democratic formula tends to be more central in their identity. But we still see a solid majority of Israelis that believe in the formula of Jewish and democratic. That does not mean that those in the right want Israel only to be a Jewish state. We still see figures that when we recently asked and measured, a majority of Israelis would still say, well, we want sort of a constitutional arrangement that is based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So within, I would say, the Zionist, the large Zionist population, there's still a relatively large common denominator. You can manipulate it with social media in a divided society that has terror and external threats, and therefore the nerves are exposed, and you can utilize those divisions and create political capital. But fundamentally, when we look at this event, assuming we had responsible, in my view, again, from my subjective view, responsible patriotic leadership, we could have turned it into a constitutional moment where we agree, not perhaps on a fully fledged constitution, but on the main constitutional principles, both in terms of the principle of separation of powers, independent judiciary, and even human rights. There's a broad consensus around those principles. And this is without disregarding some of the more challenging aspects that Tamar mentioned. Again, from a democratic vantage point, there's some challenges, but the overall picture, again, is complex and has also room for optimism.
So I want to bring Tamar on that, and because on the one hand, as Yohanan says, there is this consensus, strong consensus, at least among Israeli Jews, about Israel remaining as a Jewish and democratic state. But the democracy index does show that a plurality, at least, of Israeli Jews want the Jewish element to be stronger. I think it's something like, and so only about 30%, off the top of my head, actually believe that the current balance is right. So more Israelis would like the balance to shift. And if you take that So in other words, there's more support for shifting the balance more in the direction of Israel's Jewish identity. And on the question of human rights, there's, I think the majority sentiment was believing that human rights groups, for example, worked against Israel's interests. So if you look at those, you know better than anyone, not only the current posts of the Israeli public, but how Israeli public attitudes have changed over time. Do you share Yohanan's slightly more upbeat assessment of Israeli public opinion, the commitment to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state? Or do you see this kind of erosion of support for Israel's equal balance between its Jewishness and its democracy, support for equal rights within Israel declining, this deterioration in trust in Israel's public institutions, a sense that, do you see, do you share that optimism, or are you more concerned about the underlying trends in public opinion when it comes to Israel's democratic identity and the principles and values that underlie it?
Okay, I'll start by saying that what worries me most is the fact that there is a declining number of people who think that the state of Israel can be both Jewish and democratic. This means that even people who want it to be more democratic than Jewish are less optimistic about the possibility of this mixture to be really implemented. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you want it to be more Jewish or more democratic. The fact that we used to have the majority saying, yes, it can be at the same time Jewish and democratic, now people are more skeptical about it. And second, what we see is that the component of the Israeli public that is wishing to see Israel as more Jewish on the expense of its democratic features is getting demographically larger. It is not that people who believed in the past in the democratic ideas are now shifting into believing more in the Jewish component of the state of Israel in the future, but demographically, the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox birth rate is significantly higher. And as I said, they almost all put themselves on the right side that is not so keen on the democratic side of it. So if basically the average ultra-Orthodox family has 6.8 kids per family, and the National Orthodox 5.7, and the secular have 2 point something. And as I said, they tend to stay where the parents are. Then we have a problem here, because if they are just growing and the other very dedicated political camp to the democratic side is shrinking proportionally, we have here a problem, and we don't really know how to cut this Gordian knot between your origin or your family roots and your political views when you get older. And in the last elections, by the assessments, 1/3 of the Israeli IDF soldiers voted for Ben-Gvir. Okay, this shows you the social composition of the IDF, but also where the young people are. And before all this thing with the legislation issue started and we became really, committed to struggle against it, we were extremely really worried about these non-democratic trends. When we came to the president's house in order to submit our report, we hardly found anything positive to stay in the direction. But the awakening of the center left liberal camp as of today is in a way giving at least me some hope that things are changing, that they are not deterministic at the end of the day.
But as you said, I mean, the survey, the data shows clearly that, I think it was 64% of Israelis identify on the right, and even higher numbers, something in the region of 70% of young Israelis. Given this, and given the demographic trends that you pointed to, is it a mistake? I want to kind of rephrase a question that came in from Ilan Peleg, who's in the audience. Is it a mistake for the protest movement today not to really be making much greater outreach to try to involve Arab citizens? Because if the secular Israeli Jewish public is a shrinking segment of Israeli society, the other group that shares that concern about democracy, that wants the democratic element to be strengthened, is our Arab citizens of Israel. Should they be trying to bring in Israel's Arab citizens? Is that a mistake not to? Do you see a possibility for maybe a new kind of democratic camp even forming, Yohanan?
Well, your question assumes that there's a sort of leadership of the protest movement that is strategically planning the moves, and it's not the case. It's an entirely bottom-up event of groups and of Israelis throughout the country who are driven out of their homes. Many were never publicly active. Again, 20% of the population, given what Tamar mentioned in terms of, a portion of the population. So from that portion, it's an even greater proportion. So it's a entirely bottom-up driven event. What we're seeing in the Arab population is a different trend. While there's obviously opposition for this plan that will take away the independent institution that can provide them with some remedy as a minority, the response is not as forceful. I would imagine, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a population that, to some extent, is used to sort of being out of power. Only once in our history did the political our party representing the Arab minority participated in the government, and it's a government that survived only for 1 year. So this sense of disenchantment that mainstream Israelis are feeling, Arab Israelis have been feeling for quite a while, and therefore they're not as, I would say, shocked. Number two, we have to understand, you asked about the sort of potential of a political alliance. So yeah, if you look at the Israeli center left, as long as the ultra-Orthodox consider themselves and sort of continue to self-identify as right-wing, the center left, as long as it's defined this way, will need to be able to build an alliance with the Arab minority. But we also have to remember that the reason Mr. Netanyahu was elected now was not judicial reform. It wasn't to undermine the establishment and our relationship with our allies and our democratic allies and diaspora Jewry. It was about the inability of a large part of Israeli population to digest the fact that there's an Arab party in the coalition. So if there will be a strong protest of the Arab minority against this judicial reform, I would imagine that in an ironic manner, it will serve the purpose of the coalition. It will demonstrate to their public, it will signal to their public that it's actually a good reform, because if the Arabs are demonstrating against it. Finally, the Arab population is generally, like other populations from the lower socioeconomic echelons, tends to be less politically engaged in terms of going out to express its protests and so on. It's a population that they vote in very high numbers in local elections and municipal elections, but otherwise, in terms of political participation, they tend to participate less. Also, Likud voters generally tend to participate less in terms of protests and so on. The two elements within the Israeli public that are the Israeli right that are more politically obviously active are the settlers and the national religious group, and of course the ultra-Orthodox. So
I can see. Yeah, I want to ask Tamar maybe a bit more about our public opinion on this, because absolutely, you know, there's, as Yohanan says, there's long been this sense of disaffection and to some extent alienation. But one of the things we saw over during the course of the Bennett-Lapid government was actually kind of differences of opinion quite clearly within the Arab public about political participation, about the decision of Ram to be involved in the coalition, to become a minister. You know, some really interesting debates. Do you see changes within Arab public opinion in terms of their, you know, optimism about living in Israel, perceptions of Israeli institutions, state institutions, about participation? Is there a kind of emerging, is there in other words, a divide within the Arab public that maybe in some ways mirrors the divide within the Jewish public?
Absolutely, there are differences between Christian Arabs, Muslim Arabs, and Druze, of course. The Druze on many issues are much closer to the Jewish public, although since the nation-state law enacted in 2018, they are very frustrated of the fact that despite their I would say blood treaty with the Jews, they were not exempt from the way that the Arabs are looked upon in this piece of legislation. So, but basically they are closer to the Jews and they feel more, I would say they feel more as part of the Israeli society in general. The Muslims are a totally different story, and the Druze and the Christians, it depends on what issue. But I would say that in the last 2 years or so, we see a significant process of radicalization amongst certain elitist groups in the Arab society. They tend to say something like, it's not our game, it's all Jewish game. It doesn't really matter whether you are from Meretz, from Labour, from Yesh Atid or Likud or whatever you are all the same, and we don't want to take part in the game because it means that we actually accepts the basic assumption about the need of the state of Israel to remain a state with the Jewish majority and with a Zionist worldview. And this is stands particularly among the young and the more educated. And as we see the level of education increasing amongst the Arab sector, then we actually find ourselves in a very difficult situation. You want them to be more educated, to be more integrated, to earn more, to feel or to enjoy the high standards of living in Israel. But then you know that once they go to the university and once they meet Israeli Jews on an everyday level in I would say prominent positions, not as Tamanu is doing the less favorable jobs, then they feel more discriminated against. And the number of those saying that Israel is not a democracy and was not a democracy for its Jewish citizens is increasing dramatically in recent years. So we have a problem there. This goes back to Ilan Peleg's question, because it is very difficult to really join forces with people who do not share this basic assumption about the Jewishness of the state and the Zionist nature of it. And we do see them becoming more and more bitter. And it is so frustrating to see that the more personally well off they are, the more angry they are in general.
And is it accurate to say that paradoxically, perhaps, the tenure of the Bennett-Lapid government, which was on the one hand, celebrated as a new development to have formally include an independent Arab party, actually set back the cause of improving Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, insofar as it caused this kind of backlash among some Israeli Jews who the surveys show, at least your survey index, the democracy index shows that, increased the belief that only Jews should make decisions and that Jews should have more rights. And on the Arab public, did it actually lead to a greater sense that Israel wasn't a real democracy for them? And in other words, did the Lapid-Bennett government advance this cause, or actually, in some ways, paradoxically, set back the prospects for Jewish and Arab coexistence and equality?
Well, it was a great hope particularly for the voters of Mansour Abbas' party. I mean, they really hoped, and they are still more positive than the voters of the joint list, even today, when both of them are out of the coalition. But basically, you are right. It was an experience that was perhaps lasting for longer, and the Israeli Arab citizens would have felt some significant improvement, not on the economic level necessarily, but on the level of the inclusion in decision-making processes. It might have come out as a new, I would say, era. But as it lasted only 1 year, and as you remember, at least one of the members of Knesset who pulled the rug from under the feet of the Bennett-Lapid government was an Israeli Arab. So people are saying, okay, once we have you on board, look what you are doing to us. So it is a very, very complicated situation, which I don't see being resolved in the foreseeable future.
So I want to turn to Yohanan. Maybe we have time for one more question. Many of the people in our audience today are Jewish Americans and Jews around the world, perhaps, who have been following what's been taking place in Israel with a lot of concern. I think it's safe to say. So a question comes in from Sharon Nazarian, who's the chair of our advisory board, our community advisory board, asking about, what role does diaspora Jewry have in this? I mean, is anyone thinking about kind of two parts of this? Are people thinking about the impact this might have upon diaspora Jews? And is there does diaspora Jewish complaints and protests that have really been mounting, including from the federations and organizations that don't normally publicly criticize Israel, do you think it has any impact on how this is going to play out in the days and weeks to come?
Well, if the basic contention that what's at stake is really the soul, the democratic soul of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, the basic fundamental principle of separation of powers, all the components that make up our democracy. If indeed whoever thinks that this is really what's at stake, then all tools should be utilized and employed. We talked about the protests. There isn't one single protest that makes the difference, but all, in aggregate, those protests are making a difference. We're seeing Jewish leaders coming out. I would expect more to come out and say the basic fundamental truth that our identification and connection with Israel very much depends on the fact that it will remain faithful to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So you're right, we've seen things that we've never seen before, federation leaders coming out, lay leaders from the community. But I think, of course, it matters. Israelis care about it. Israelis care about national unity and unity of the Jewish people. We have the nation state bill that grants an official voice to diaspora Jewry. Israel is the nation state of Jews throughout the world. This is actually defined in a constitutional level. So Jews throughout the world and Jewish leaders have a voice and should use all ways to make this voice heard. And I wouldn't give specific advice. Now, obviously, also Israel has a strong, critical, crucial, strategic relationship with the United States. While we are practicing in self-erosion, there are still countries in our region that want to threaten our state, and the alliance with the United States is absolutely critical, and it depends obviously on this formula of shared values and shared interests. And if the shared values component will be eroded over time, clearly it will have implications. So again, I would expect also this message to resonate. So of course, Israelis understand the importance of their relationship both with American Jewry and with the American administration. And those who think that this change in Israel will have implications should make their voice heard.
So Tamar, maybe I have
perhaps the last element, if to be there are Israelis now in Israel, as we've seen, that are rising up and fighting to preserve this miracle, and of course also finding ways to ally with them and support them would be critical at this point, especially since some of those radical forces that are trying to bring about this overhaul are also supported by external forces.
So Tamar, we have just time for one last question. I just want to, build on what Yohanan was saying. Given your knowledge of public opinion, do you think that Israelis, and particularly Jewish Israelis, would respond well to diaspora Jews voicing criticisms of this? Do they see this as an internal issue, an internal Israeli issue about which diaspora Jews really should have no voice, no role? And similarly, what do you think the reaction would be to, say, an American's a stronger intervention in this by the US administration? And recently, Ambassador Nides, made a pretty modest, mild comment about slowing down the judicial overhaul, and there was quite a strong pushback from some ministers in the Israeli government, basically saying, mind your own business. Do you think Israelis would take that view, like America, if the United
States? One very marginal minister who needed some more attention in the social networks. So I wouldn't know.
So do you agree, Tamar, with Yohanan, that Israelis would welcome this? Whether it's the diaspora Jews or the US administration kind of clearly voicing their concerns, and that this may impact the dynamic in Israel, it may shift public opinion further. Do you see that happening?
Well, there is a difference between the diaspora Jews and the American administration, because there are limitations to what even Israelis are ready to take from a foreign state, regardless of the fact that it always comes on top as the best friend of Israel. And certainly on the right side, they are more, I would say, critical of such interventions, particularly as it goes against their view of how things should be decided and implemented. For example, the settlements, of course, they will not see in a positive way an American intervention or administration intervention in preventing the expansion of the settlement. They'll see it as something that a sovereign state cannot take even from its closest ally. Okay, Although, as you know, Netanyahu is the very quote unquote American in his orientation, and despite his controversies with the various American presidents, besides one, he is very careful not to go head on with the American administration. So he is trying to appease both sides, the Americans and the settlers. As for the American Jews, it is more complicated because of the Reform Orthodox rivalry. And the American Jewry is perceived as very, at least pro-reform, even if they are not themselves reform. And the ultra-Orthodox will see it in negative terms because they'll think that this might serve as an opportunity for the reform community to have deeper roots in Israel or get some benefits that they are asking for years now. So there is a complicated situation here. Certainly the center and the left will welcome some kind of intervention, but in a friendly manner. And you know that there is a joke going on. Why do the doves in Israel have this finger shorter? Because they always say now American pressure will come, and it never comes. So now it's a very sensitive issue. I think that some kind of friendly advices would be welcome. However, pressure will not be welcome, particularly as we still see a significant number of Israelis who think that the Israeli Jews and the American Jews are very, very different from each other. Although Taglit and Birthright helped in this on this issue, but still they see themselves as different, and therefore, if things are done, they should be done in a very, I would say, delicate manner.
Well, I see we've already gone over time. We could continue this really fascinating conversation for much longer. We've just touched on many of the issues. It's clearly a complex and dynamic situation that's happening in Israel, and we will be continuing at the Nazarian Center to paying close attention to it. I'm sure at the Israel Democracy Institute, you will be paying close attention to it, maybe closer attention than anybody to what's taking place.
It's beyond close attention. We're in full action in response to it. So we're very, very active to try and educate the Israeli public and the Israeli decision-making community on this overhaul and its implications, and to help develop options.
Well, I want to thank you for taking time out of that very important task and speaking to us today, explaining the situation, and I think giving us a bigger picture of Israeli public attitudes about democracy and a whole host of other issues. I'll encourage our audience members who want to read more, about the Israeli Democracy Index, that it's available on your website. There's both, you can read the highlights and the survey itself. It's really, I think, offers a host of insights. So I would encourage you all to check that out. I also want to encourage you all, while I can, to join us this coming Sunday for our online conference with Israel's Haaretz newspaper, where we will be talking about the current government in Israel and its foreign relations and foreign policy, particularly questions that aren't receiving as much attention as everybody's focusing on the domestic politics of the moment. So I hope you'll all join us for that. That's this Sunday, March 5th. Again, I want to really thank Dr. Tamar Herman and Yochanan Plesner for joining us, and the Israel Democracy Institute for this second time that we were able to work together. And thank everybody in the audience for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night from Israel.